All right, everybody, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive? We're going deep on a case that's captivated people for, well, decades now. 1987, small town Arkansas.
Sounds peaceful already, right?
You'd think so, but two teenage boys, Don Henry and Kevin Ives, they're found dead on the railroad tracks, and right away people are saying, oh, tragic accident.
But if only it were that simple.
This is the boys on the tracks, and trust me, the more you learn about this case, the weirder, the more confusing it gets.
Absolutely. It's one of those cases where the pieces never quite seem to fit, and the deeper you dig, the more questions you uncover.
So let's start with what we know, or at least what they told us we knew at the beginning. The official story, right? Don and Kevin, they were out late, they'd been smoking marijuana, Keane's kids, right? And they fell asleep on the tracks. Tragic, but open and shut.
See, that's what doesn't sit right. Their families, especially the parents, they knew that story didn't track. Something was off about the boys' behavior that night. It's like they were different somehow.
Out of character.
Exactly. Out of character.
Right.
Like it just wasn't like them to be out that late to begin with, let alone acting the way they were. It felt wrong.
And that's where that gut feeling comes in, that parental instinct that's hard to ignore.
And thank goodness they didn't ignore it, because it turns out it was the families who really pushed for answers, pushed for the truth to come out. They demanded a second autopsy.
And I'm guessing that second autopsy, that's where everything changed.
Completely changed the game. Because the findings from that second autopsy, they painted a completely different picture than the first. They found a stab wound on Don Henry, a stab wound, and Kevin Ives. His injuries showed signs that he was unconscious before he ever ended up on those tracks. We're not talking about a couple kids falling asleep anymore. This was murder.
Hold on, wait, back up a sec. The first autopsy, they missed a stab wound? How is that even possible?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's what really started to raise those red flags. I mean, was this just incompetence on the part of the medical examiner? Or was there something more deliberate going on?
A cover-up.
Exactly. Were they trying to sweep something under the rug? And if so, why?
And when you start digging into the background of where this all happened, well, things get even more suspicious. This wasn't just any town in Arkansas. This area, it was a known hub for drug trafficking back in the 80s.
A lot of illegal activity slipping under the radar.
Exactly. And one of the big theories surrounding Don and Kevin's deaths is that they stumbled onto something they shouldn't have. Maybe they witnessed a drug drop.
Which, for those who don't know, is basically a prearranged spot where traffickers leave drugs to be picked up later. It's a way for them to minimize their risk, avoid getting caught red-handed.
So if Don and Kevin saw something like that, maybe even recognize someone involved.
It would definitely give someone a motive to silence them permanently.
And here's where it gets even crazier. Some people believe this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill drug operation. There are those who think this case could be connected to something much, much bigger, the Iran-Contra affair.
Now, that's a whole other can of worms. For those who don't remember, this was a huge political scandal in the 80s. Basically, the U.S. government was secretly selling arms to Iran.
Illegal arms dealing.
Right, and then they'd use the profits to fund the Contras, who were rebels fighting against the government in Nicaragua.
Super illegal, super controversial.
And one of the big allegations that came out of the Iran-Contra affair was that elements within the U.S. government, like maybe even the CIA, were turning a blind eye to drug trafficking by the Contras. They were letting it happen, maybe even helping it happen.
So some people believe that Don and Kevin might have stumbled upon a similar operation, maybe even involving the same players right there in their own backyard.
It sounds far-fetched, but then again,
stranger things have happened, right? And it gets even creepier. After Don and Kevin died, several people connected to the case, witnesses, people who claimed to have information, they started dying under, well, let's just say suspicious circumstances.
We're talking about what, at least 3 witnesses who died in supposed accidents? A supposed suicide?
One guy, Keith McCaskill, right? He was found dead in his car and they ruled it a suicide.
But his family, they never did it. They said there were inconsistencies, things that just didn't add up.
And then you've got Greg Collins, another potential witness. He just vanished. Gone without a trace.
Never found.
So now you've got these deaths, disappearances, and it creates this atmosphere of fear. Like, if you knew something, would you come forward?
You'd be risking your life, or at least that's how it must have felt to a lot of people.
And then there's a question of the local police. Rumors of corruption, talk of some officers being involved in the drug trade themselves.
It wouldn't be the first time law enforcement was accused of being in bed with criminals.
It makes you wonder who you can trust, right?
Exactly. And it just adds another layer of complexity to an already tangled web.
Now, The FBI did get involved eventually, but even they couldn't crack the case.
They never made any arrests related to Don and Kevin's deaths anyway.
And that's what makes this case so frustrating, right? All these years later, we still don't have any real answers. It makes you wonder if we ever will.
And it's tragic, because at the heart of it, you have two boys whose lives were cut short. Two families who've been denied justice.
It's heartbreaking, and I can't help but think about how different things might be if we had the technology we have now back then. DNA analysis, for example. Imagine if they'd had that at their disposal.
It might have blown the case wide open.
Maybe we would finally know the truth about what happened to Don Henry and Kevin Ives.
Or at the very least, we might have a better understanding of the events that led to their deaths.
It's a case that stays with you, that makes you think about the power of silence, the lengths people will go to protect themselves, protect their secrets.
And it makes you question what really happened that night on those railroad tracks in Arkansas. What were Don and Kevin caught in the middle of?
It really makes you wonder, were they just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was there something more sinister at play? We may never know for sure.